Hey everyone. So we wrapped up at the end of class on Thursday pretty quickly. So I wanted to make just a short video just to make sure that everybody is on the same page and is comfortable with those shifts due to imposing taxes in the market. So when we ended, we had looked at the market for shoes and we said we're going to put a tax on consumers. Right? And before that, we had taxed gambling, but we put the tax on the casinos themselves, on the producers. So I'm going to redo this shoe graph just to make sure that we didn't go too fast, make sure everybody's on the same page. And then I think when we left, I told you to think about what happens to consumer surplus and producer surplus as a result of the tax. So let me just draw this again. We were looking at the market for shoes, so we need our graph. There's price and quantity. I labeled the origin. Okay, so these are pairs of shoes. There's some demand for shoes, some supply of shoes. There's an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. Now, we were going to put a tax on the consumers of shoes, right? So it looks like I noted that up here. Place a $10 tax on consumers. Now, when we put a tax on consumers, is that going to show up in the supply curve or the demand curve? Well, the consumers are on the demand curve, right? So the shift will occur with the demand curve. Now, a $10 tax. If I valued shoes at a certain amount, when the government puts a tax on it, it's not like all of a sudden the shoe is more valuable to me than it used to be. So if I was willing to pay $100 for a pair of shoes before the tax, if that was the marginal benefit, that was my willingness to pay. Nothing about the government creating a tax changes that. But the existence of that tax will affect the maximum I will pay to the shoe store, right? So if I'm getting running shoes and I'm going to Medved or Fleet Feet, the maximum that I will be willing to pay to the store for the shoes is now $10 less than it used to be. So we can think of this as a decrease or a leftward shift in the demand curve. Now remember, when we put the tax on the producers, we thought of that as a decrease or a leftward shift in the supply curve. Here we're going to think of this as a leftward shift in the demand curve. So here's D2, right? It's a leftward shift. And notice that vertically, it's exactly equal to the tax. So I'm going to put tax equals $10, right? Tax is a price measurement. I measure it on the vertical axis. I have to measure it straight up and down. So what happens in my graph? Well, let's use the light green. So now there is a new equilibrium, and it's right here. And the price that I will pay to Fleet Feet, so the price the producer gets is now less than it used to be. But when I buy the shoes, I have to pay that price plus $10. So I add the $10 on the top. Now I know that the distance between the old and the new demand curve is exactly $10, so that I know when I add that $10 on, it takes me up to the original demand curve. And that is the total cost of the shoes to me out of pocket. So I pay the first, $90 to the producer, and then I pay, well, whatever this E price is, right? I pay to the producer, and then I pay $10 on top of that. I had to catch myself because the new equilibrium price is not necessarily $10 less than what it was before. And in fact, if you know that this distance right here, make it a little bit wider, that distance, if that's $10, then you know that that the price has not changed by $10 because the price you pay to the producer is less than it used to be, but not $10 less, right? And the price the consumer pays is more than they used to pay, but not $10 more, because $10 is this whole distance from here to here. And so it ends up being split somehow between the consumer and the producer. The consumer pays more than they used to, and the producer gets less than they used to. And that difference in between is the tax. So where on the graph is the tax revenue? Well, actually, I think, we had done the surplus. We should add in the surplus too. So before we added the tax, before we imposed the tax, was there surplus in this graph? Absolutely. There was consumer surplus up here, right? Everything below the demand curve and down to the equilibrium price. And there was producer surplus below the equilibrium price and down to the supply curve. So Now, what happens to that surplus? Well, it gets smaller, right? Producer surplus, I said producer, all right? Producer surplus now is everything above the supply curve up to the price that they actually get to keep, right? So the producer surplus is this area down here, but they've lost some. They've lost everything above PP, right? The price the producer gets up to PE. And then what about the consumers? Well, the consumers still get surplus from the demand curve down to the price that they actually pay, which is P sub C. So they get that top triangle, but they've lost part of their original triangle as well. Where does it go? Well, part of it goes to the government, right? They collect this much tax on this many units, right? So we didn't label Q2 here. Q2 is the amount of shoes they actually sell. So this rectangle right here, the number of shoes that are still sold times the tax per shoe, that gives you the tax revenue that the government collects. That's the tax revenue. Where does it come from? Well, some of it comes out of consumer surplus and some of it comes out of producer surplus. So when we think about incidence, you say, well, who bears the legal incidence of the tax? The legal incidence is on consumers, right? Who you place the tax on initially, that is the legal incidence. But then what is the economic incidence? The economic incidence is shared, right? Both the producer and the consumer bear some burden of the tax. Both producer and consumer bear some burden of the tax. And you can see that in two ways. One, because this tax revenue box with the green bars, it's carved out of what would have been some consumer surplus and some producer surplus. Both parties lose some surplus to pay the tax. Additionally, you can see the change in price. Consumers pay more than they used to, and producers get less than they used to. So there you can see the economic incidence. There's one other important thing we need to label on this graph. There's consumer surplus that's given up that is not picked up by the government, and there's producer surplus that's given up and is not picked up by the government. And that's in those two small triangles to the right of the tax revenue box, right? The fact that fewer shoes are sold means that there's potential consumer surplus and potential producer surplus, and that's all given up. All right, and we call that the deadweight loss of taxation. So we had done most of that at the end of class. Wanted to make sure that we did it a little slower and then followed up on the deadweight loss and the tax revenue. There's one last thing that I want to show you, and that is the similarity between the tax on the producer and the tax on the consumer, or really how it doesn't matter who bears the legal incidence. The economic incidence is determined by the nature of supply and demand. So what if we looked at shoes and we started back here at the initial equilibrium and we said, okay, now instead of placing a $10 tax on consumers, let's place a $10 tax on producers. So how would we think about that? We would think of that as a leftward shift in the supply curve by the vertical distance of $10, right? So the supply curve would shift to the left. This vertical distance would be exactly $10, and that the new equilibrium would be here. And so consumers would have to pay this amount for the shoes, but $10 of that would go straight to the government. So the amount that the producers would get to keep after the tax would be P sub P, and that would be the tax revenue, and there'd be the same deadweight loss, and the end result looks exactly the same. So who you put the tax on up front doesn't have any effect whatsoever on who bears the economic incidence. Economic incidence is determined by supply and demand. You can put the tax on the producer, you can put it on the consumer. If we go back to our initial graph where we put a tax on gambling, right? What if instead of taxing casinos, we taxed the gamblers themselves? We taxed them by that same amount. That would have shifted the demand curve. It would have gone through this point right here. And we would have paid this amount to the consumer, or gamblers would have paid this amount to the casino, and they paid the tax on top of that. And after that, everything else would look exactly the same. So there's no economic effect from who you put the legal incidence on, who you actually impose the tax on. All of the real heavy lifting, or the real important part, is the economic incidence. The legal incidence, in some cases, it might be that one party can pay it, that it might be more efficient, like easier to collect from one party than the other. Maybe it's easier to reduce fraud or tax evasion by charging one party. Or sometimes it might just be easier to disguise the tax by charging one party instead of the other. At any rate, the takeaway here is it doesn't matter which party you put the tax on, the economic incidence is the same, and that's determined by the nature of supply and demand. So there you go. That's our quick wrap up. I'm going to post this in Blackboard, and we'll follow up next week.